Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Damian Cardona from the Department of Public Information, and we are all pleased today that you have joined us for the launch of the 2017 Financing for Development Progress and Prospect Report. And today, to tell us more about the report that was just released this morning, about the report's key findings, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Wu Hongbo, the UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, DESA. He's accompanied by, on the far left, Ms. Shari Spiegel, Chief of the Policy Analysis and Development Branch of the Financing for Development Division, as well as, on the right of Mr. Wu, by Alexander Trepelkov, the Director of the Financing for Development Office, also in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So, with that, let me turn the floor to Mr. Wu, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, dear colleagues, welcome to this briefing. As our spokesman said, the 2017 report of the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development is released officially. And this report is the first substantive report on the progress and the prospects for development financing. Implementation of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development has begun in real earnest. This report provides a first assessment of progress in implementing the financing for development outcomes and the sustainable development goals. It draws on the expertise, analysis, and the data from over 50 international institutions that make up the task force. These include the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, as well as UN agencies such as UNCTAD and the UNDP. The task force, which is led by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, represents a consensus view of all major international organizations. I will provide you with some overarching findings, and our colleagues and I will be happy to take your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, it is gratifying to note that the progress can be reported in all 7 action areas of the Addis Agenda, including all financing flows. This covers domestic public resources, domestic and international private business and finance, and international development cooperation, trade, debt, systemic issues, and science, technology, innovation, and capacity building. Nevertheless, as highlighted in the report and in the online annex, many implementation gaps still remain. In particular, the challenging global environment in 2016 had significant impacts on national efforts to achieve sustainable development. The current global growth trajectory will not deliver the goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. Despite expectations of improved growth in 2017 and 2018, the current global environment bodes poorly for the achievement of the SDGs. Global unemployment is expected to increase in both 2017 and 2018, with young people continuing to experience unacceptable high level of joblessness. There is particular worry for the poorest and the most vulnerable countries and the people. The report finds that at least developed countries will fall short of eradicating poverty by large margins under the current growth trajectory. Unemployment is expected to grow in both this year and next year, and the sluggish international trade growth is both a symptom of and a contribution factor to low investment and the global economic slowdown. It is clear now that changes in policies will be needed. Currently, there is much uncertainty about the direction of the economic, financial, social, and environmental policies of major countries. This contributes to the higher than normal level of risks in the global economy. National policy actions that are aligned with sustainable development goals are crucial. These must be combined with international cooperation to boost sustainable and inclusive global growth and to accelerate achievements of the SDGs. Many of the challenges that countries face, including slow economic growth, climate change, and humanitarian crisis, have cross-border or global repercussions and cannot be addressed by any one actor alone. Multilateral cooperation is essential to tackle global problems and support national efforts. A strong multilateral system, along with the financial and the capacity support to countries most in need, is essential and necessary to eliminate poverty and meet the SDGs. This task force itself is an exercise in strengthening coherence of the multilateral system. It is also an example of how the multilateral system is jointly responding to global problems. The 2017 report, with its accompanying online annex, is comprehensive in coverage. I encourage you to make use of the full length of these resources. They provide an assessment across all types of financing, including levels of official development assistance, known as ODA, as well as policies. The report also includes thematic coverage of several important topics, including long-term investment, especially in infrastructure, and particularly in least developed countries. Indeed, the report emphasizes the ramped-up public and private investment in sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure will help stimulate sustainable and inclusive global growth, creating a virtuous cycle. Well, there are infrastructure gaps. For example, the need to invest in clean energy in all country groupings. The infrastructure investment deficit is particularly deep in LDCs. Development banks, including national, regional, and multilateral development banks, can be an important source of long-term credit to help finance infrastructure. However, long-term investment in the higher growth will not suffice to eradicate extreme poverty. Measures are needed to directly improve the living conditions of the poor and the vulnerable. The report highlights measures such as universal social protection floors and address vulnerability and leave no one behind. Universal social protection floors are a tried and tested way to reduce poverty. They economically empower poor people by raising productivity and the growth along with incomes. The same principles apply at the international level, with effective and sufficiently financed safety net for poor countries. The report also discusses how the agendaed impact of all investment, for example, in both infrastructure and social protection, should be considered. Plans and the policies need to be gender responsive. Ladies and gentlemen, integrated national financing framework is a critical tool for implementation, as called for in Addis Agenda. These are needed to address countries' specific circumstances, provide coherence to the many policy actions, and to set priorities for country development strategies. The United Nations system is already helping countries assess the financing landscape, spot opportunities, and develop these integrated plans. And the report recommends that these efforts be taken further. This is the report. Thank you very much for attention. I'm now ready to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, USG Wu. The hard copies of the report are on the table at the entrance. As Mr. Wu mentioned, the electronic annexes are available at the DESA website. So now I open the floor for any questions or comments, please.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. Thanks a lot for coming to do the briefing. I wanted to ask you about, this is just one of the many issues in the report, the, quote, resolving unsustainable debt situations. I know that there was been in the General Assembly a move for orderly resolution of sovereign debt crises like the one in Greece and in other countries. Where does it, I mean, it was reported at the time that the GA passed it, although a lot of the more affluent countries didn't agree to it. According to you, where do things stand in terms of that issue and in terms of countries facing debt and especially having kind of vulture funds buy up their debt on the cheap, being able to not be held hostage to these type of what are called vulture investors? Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm the person who don't like debts, so I will refer the question to Sari.
Thank you. So there are a series of a bunch of issues and things going on right now in terms of debt. The the GA resolution which passed was passed. But moving forward, the question is what happens with implementation. I think the first thing we have to say is that there are increasing risks in the global economy right now, that although debt numbers are not high, there are certain countries, particularly some SIDS, some small island developing states, that have high debt burdens, and there is a particular risk that if global interest rates rise, there's been an increase in borrowing, particularly in capital markets borrowing, by some low-income and LDC countries, and that if interest rates rise, we could be faced with another debt crisis. So I think that there is work ongoing both within the UN system as well as outside the UN system. So within the UN system, UNCTAD works on these issues. UNDESA has a program that works on these issues and that brings together alternative voices to discuss debt solutions. The IMF is doing a serious work on these issues, as well as there's a work stream working within the G20 that's looking at these issues, and the International Financial Architecture part of the work stream. And I think that most of the works to date is now focusing on what's called market-based solutions, which are contracts within loans, within debt contracts, and ways to make those more efficient and more able to actually address the crises. In addition to that, one of the issues that people are discussing, and there's a lot of work going on to, is having state contingent debt. So that one question is if you have to write off the debt, but what about if a country, during the tough times, when your GDP and your economy slows down, that's when it becomes the hardest for you to repay your debt, and therefore there are to write into loan contracts that at those times countries can actually not repay the debt and have a breathing period during that period. So there's work going on a series of streams. There will be a side event tomorrow with the IMF and the IMF and UNDP with UNDESA working with them together on looking at some of these risks and some of the ideas and alternative ideas to help countries better respond to these risks. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think the point is that we have last year, by issuing the first inaugural report, established a monitoring framework that has not been there before. With that framework for monitoring the progress, we managed to identify the gaps and the progress already made in the 7 action areas, including covering over 100 commitments made by the member states in Addis Ababa Action Agenda. I would say that we are not very experienced in many of the areas. However, we have indicators. We have tools to make the area clearer, to identify the way forward with some recommendations. So this is encouraging and gratifying. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, madam.
My question is, how do you
Can you please identify yourself?
Sorry, I'm from China Central Television. Yes. My question is, how do you evaluate China's efforts and achievement in regard of poverty reduction? Thank you.
I try to make a gender balance.
You are the expert, Mr.
Maybe you say something.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. I think that the Chinese achievements in poverty reduction are quite impressive. The purpose of the report is to deal with the issues from the global perspective. So it doesn't go too much into the details of individual country situations. But as far as I am aware of, China has made tremendous progress in terms of poverty reduction and poverty eradication. But this is also reviewed in the context of the SDG implementation. As you know, poverty eradication, extreme poverty in all its forms and manifestations is the Sustainable Development Goal 1. The reports dealing with the implementation of the SDGs are not necessarily the subject of this report, but a series of other reports. Also, a number of SDGs, including SDG 1, will be the focus of the high-level political forum on sustainable development this year. So we approach this issue from the financial angle, but a more comprehensive analysis will be done in the context of HLPF. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I would like to answer your question directly, not because I'm being Chinese. I'm United Nations Under Secretary General. One word is very impressive. The reason why. Now, in China, last year, you have still 50 million people living in extreme poverty last year. But the Chinese government and people managed to pull out 10 million people out of extreme poverty just in 1 year. What is more encouraging is that the government is planning to help the other 40 million people out of extreme poverty by the year 2020. So 10 million every year in the next 4 years. That is 10 years ahead of United Nations SDG number 1. So I would say it's not only impressive for China, but also is a role model for the other countries in their efforts to eradicate extreme poverty. There are two things I think that may need our attention. Number one is the principle of accountability. I understand in the next 4 years, the Chinese officials at all the levels, starting from the national level to the village level, with each has responsibility to help certain number of people. I was in China some months ago, and I talked to a Chinese director, equivalent to Alex here. He has responsibility to help 3 households. I don't know how many people, 3 families, under extreme poverty line. The deadline is 2020. So accountability is one thing. Second, the disaggregated information is also very useful. We are talking about extreme poverty, poor people. But if you ask further questions, you will get no answers. Why they still remain poor? Is it because of a disability? Is it because of a lack of education or poor health? They could not afford the medical treatment? So that is very interesting. I'm fully aware the Chinese government have targeted resolutions based on the disaggregated information. So they know exactly the reasons behind the poverty of each family, of those 40 million. I think this is another thing we learn from this process. I really have my fingers crossed for the success of the Chinese government. If you can do it, many other countries can be also successful. Thank you very much.
Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. I'm just wondering, in addition to talking about the gaps in ODA funding, which continue, have you made any suggestions? I'm just quickly looking through this, I don't see them, in terms of what used to be called other innovative mechanisms for financing. In the past, suggestions have been made for some universal taxes to be applied, for example, even on internet service, on air travel, other ways of raising funds for supporting sustainable development. Have you discussed any of that in this report? And if not, why have you avoided that subject? Because in the past, that's been very much a topic of discussion. I think the Monterey Conference, for example. Thank you.
Well, your question touches upon two separate issues, but they are closely interconnected. First is the commitments already made have not been honored fully. So we continue to urge internationally the donor countries to meet their commitments as early as possible. We will have our voice heard whenever we can. We will speak loudly for the LDCs and the vulnerable countries and people. And secondly is creative financing. This is very much on the agenda of the discussions. You mentioned some, for instance, the tax system is also very, very important. In some other countries, like the developing countries in Africa, the illegal financial flow is twice as much as incoming ODA total amount. So just imagine if you have an efficient tax system, the money will stop and will be used, diverted to the implementation of Agenda 2030. And there are some other innovative ideas being circulating. For instance, actually some countries are doing this, is tax on carbon. The money revenues will go into the implementation of clean energy. And I would like to ask Sherry to furnish you with some more ideas.
Thank you. So the report itself does not go into what was generally called innovative sources of financing. There are questions about the definition of what that means. So traditionally within the UN context, it meant international public finance and meant taxes that were used and tied to development issues. The term has been broadened a bit so that others refer to it much more broadly now. The World Bank uses a different definition, et cetera. So those were, we as a task force are following up on what the commitments were, as Mr. Wu said, in the Addis Agenda and the Monterey and Doha Declaration, which includes the many of these innovative mechanisms, including carbon taxes, including taxes. There are some new mechanisms that were launched in Addis, including a tax on mining in certain African countries that goes to, I think it's to nutrition and health, that the money was tied to. And those are all followed up on the online annex. So because the report, as you see, we tried to keep it from being 1,000 pages long. And so there are many different commitments, and each year different things are going to be highlighted in the report directly. And then the online annex goes into all of these issues in much more detail. And so we follow up on those commitments and how much money is being raised and what information we have on each of those different types of mechanisms on the online annex. And one of the issues is that much of that money that was raised internationally tends to get counted as ODA. So there are questions also of the accounting of these and how they're used or not used, et cetera. But it's covered in the online annex. Thanks.
Okay, so if we don't have more questions, I want to thank USGU for being here this afternoon and his colleagues from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And I guess the work for the 2018 report has already started. So good luck and good morning to all of you. Good afternoon to all of you.